Hello, everyone. So I'm going to do a little experiment here. I'm finding out a couple of things. First of all, I feel like whenever I'm in the camera, I'm kind of looking off into the side. And I also find that I'm kind of feeding off of my own image and probably giving you more detail than you really need at this point. So I am going to, well, let me start by saying I think everybody needs lots of historical detail for lots of reasons, but given what we have to do in this course, I think it's probably best if I opt on the side of a little more brevity. So I'm going to see if I can achieve that by taking myself out of the picture so that I cannot be seen, and I am just going to lecture through these slides. We will all see one another during Drill Down Fridays, which I look forward to. So that'll be an opportunity to meet as a face-to-face class. But perhaps I can make these lectures a bit more on the brief side if I take out my picture. So here you are. Here are the topics that we're going to cover from the book in the slides that I'm going to show you today in the virtual lecture. So why don't you take a few moments and copy those down. And you can always just pause this since you're watching it on YouTube and do what you need to do and then resume watching it. So to tell you what I hope to do today, I am looking toward building out the colonial picture, and I'll show you what I mean. Here are England's 13 original North American colonies that rebel against it and form the United States, with the exception of Maine, which is part of Massachusetts until 1820. I've phrased this very carefully, and that is because England has a total of 39 colonies in the Western Hemisphere at the time of the American Revolution, with colonies in the Caribbean. It has taken over Canada from the French, and it is a pretty vast empire, and not all of it rebels. Why do we spend so much about talking about the American Revolution? Because we are the Americans. So obviously we are looking at the origins of our political system and our national story. But there's a lot more to the English Empire than we tend to think, and why those other places did not rebel along with these 13 colonies on the coast of North America is an interesting story for consideration, and we'll probably talk about that a little bit as we either do our drill down at the time of the American Revolution or at some other point. But for now, I just want you to look at this picture, and we talked a little bit about Virginia, which gets its start right here in the Chesapeake and the James River. I believe that's the James right there. And Massachusetts and Plymouth being absorbed by Massachusetts. So we've only really talked about the evolution of two colonies that will become states. And now, of course, in this picture, we have 13. So I'm going to fill in a few more of those stories. But for now, I want to point out to you that we tend to think about the colonies in terms of region. So you can see them spelled out here, the New England colonies, the middle colonies, and then I just want to further subdivide the southern colonies into two regions. So they would be the Deep South, which consists of both Carolinas and eventually Georgia, and the Chesapeake, which is Virginia, and Maryland. And you can see them there. They're all in this dark orange clump here, but we've just broken them out a little bit further because their colonial stories are different. So it's way easier to talk about them in terms of regions. Regardless of whether they were part of New England, the middle colonies of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, or the ones that are further to the south, uh, was irrelevant to the fact that they are all subject as they mature and as they start to produce materials that are attractive to England. They're all subject to what's called the mercantilist system. And I have a little outline of it for you here. Some of you might have heard of a process called triangle trade in previous classes, and that is that goods went from North America to England, specifically to Europe. I mean, specifically to England, that they do actually go all over Europe, but specifically to England. Um, and then things come from Europe to Africa, and it's there that those goods are then traded for finished goods that come back, and enslaved people that come back to the United States. I'm sorry, to the North American colonies. I'm really ditzy right now. That is not quite the picture, as we can see here from this little uh, illustration of trade networks. Trade networks went all over the place in all directions. And I'll illuminate that a little bit further in just a minute. But for now, I want to talk about the basic idea of what mercantilism is. Mercantilism is the philosophical idea of keeping as many goods as you need to create a strong society within the borders of that society, or within the sphere of influence of that society. So, for example, if you're a society that thrives on pine trees, and pine trees were used in shipbuilding, they were one of the key trees in shipbuilding, you would want to make sure that you had unlimited access to pine trees at all times so that you could continue with that important enterprise to you. And that's what the mercantilist system is. It's keeping all money and all goods that you need basically under the control of the influence of your parent country, which is in our case England. And that's really why you have colonies, because colonies are filling in the picture for goods that you need that you cannot grow from home or can't grow in profusion. Look at the scale of England, Scotland, and England's unwilling colony, Ireland, over here. Compare the size of that to their colonial holdings in North America. Clearly, there's a lot more that can be going on here than can be going on here to feed this nation, to produce materials that can help this nation lead a good life. So that's why colonies become so important. That's why they are protected militarily. That's why they are given other types of financial supports. That's why people go to war over them. And certainly war will enter into the picture in a big way in the lecture for next week. So the colony itself, this is a little bit backward. Think of this as England's North American colonies. And they are producing raw materials. That is, they are producing, as illustrated here, whale oil, lumber, fur, rice, silk, tobacco, etc. And those raw materials are being shipped off to the colonizing country. In the colonizing country, there are workers there who are going to make these materials into finished products that both people in Europe want and people back in North America who ship the raw goods in the first place want. So there's something good going on here in the sense that it's providing work, it's providing for the birth of industry in the colonizing country. And then what happens to all the goods they produce? Well, they hope that other places will want them, such as other European nations and Africa. And then goods are also being shipped back in completed form to the North American colonies. And this is really important. they're available there at a lower price because it's kind of all in the colonial family. So the prices are kept low. The English keep their people back in England working. Now you don't need that kind of safety valve thing anymore that we talked about last week with the enclosure of sheep and all the people who aren't working. Now people can work in manufactures, and they have people who can buy this material spread out throughout our Atlantic world. So the basic movement of goods is from North America to England, England to the rest of Europe, and then specifically to Africa. There is also some direct trade to Africa. There's some trade from North America to the Caribbean. And then, of course, what is in our human story, the most important piece of this trade network, the movement of enslaved people. And we're going to talk about how slavery evolves in just a few minutes. For now, I just want to fill in a few more colonial pictures. And I'm going to start out with the founding of Carolina. And note, I call it Carolina, not North or South. For much of America's early existence up until about the middle part of the 18th century, it is simply called Carolina. The two colonies are kind of merged together, even though they had different founding stories. North Carolina, as seen right here, is basically settled by people who are pushed out of Virginia. So they were people on kind of the lowest economic rung of Virginia. They head a little bit further south. They find new tobacco lands in North Carolina, and also engage very heavily in the trade of deer skins. You might say, oh, that doesn't sound too lucrative. It actually was. Deer skins were used for footwear. They were used for gloves. They were used for a certain degree for headgear. And were sent back to England, of course, to be manufactured into wearable things, and then shipped back to the colonies in that wearable form. It's South Carolina that I'm really interested in now, and let me lay you a little groundwork here. The earliest South Carolinians, the people who found this colony, have also been squeezed out of a colonial territory, but it's not in North America. They have basically been squeezed out of the sugar growing plantations of the Caribbean, most notably Barbados and Jamaica. These are small islands. Sugar takes up a lot of room. So what happens if you're a planter and you have 4 sons? Those 4 sons really can't each have farms of their own after a couple generations because there's simply no room on these islands. So where do those children go to seek their fortunes? They will go to newly emerging colonies in North America and try to make their fortunes there. So they're squeezed out of growing sugar, but what they do realize grows extremely well in South Carolina is something not as lucrative as sugar, but certainly a necessary crop. And that crop would be not cotton, as a lot of people might say, but rice. Rice, when it is dried and when it's winnowed out, is an extremely durable product. It's also very filling. It's quite nutritious, and it becomes the ideal food for the 17th and 18th centuries because it can be transported around fairly easily. People don't have to eat it right away. It is also the food of enslavement. This is the food that is forced upon enslaved Africans as they are working the sugar plantations of the Caribbean because it's shelf stable and it's cheap and it's very, very filling. So cotton does not become a major colonial crop at all. It really doesn't become a crop of any consequence until a couple decades after the American Revolution. But these regions here and later Georgia, will be especially known for the growing of this crop that is critical to the growing of sugar and critical to slavery, which is rice. One of the actually, I'll hold off to talk about that in a few minutes. Okay, the Holy Experiment. The Holy Experiment refers to the founding of Pennsylvania. And why is it called the Holy Experiment? Founded in the hold that thought just for another moment. I just wanted to say something very quickly. Slaves are going to be forced to bring in rice crops. One of the other characteristics specifically of South Carolina is that the people who migrate to this region, who have come from the Caribbean, bring an especially physically brutal form of slavery to South Carolina with them, which will explain a lot when we look at South Carolina's history in the American Civil War. There is slavery everywhere in these 13 original colonies that become the United States. South Carolina slavery and later Georgia slavery come out of a Caribbean form of treating fellow human beings, which has a physical brutality to it that far surpasses what's going on in other colonial regions. But I'll explain that more fully at another time. So I'm sorry about that. Getting back to the Holy Experiment and getting back to this different type of colony, because just like all Europeans are not the same in terms of colonization, all colonies are not the same either. Pennsylvania is the only colony that does not have direct access to the Atlantic coast. Just keep in mind, folks, that Vermont is going to be the 14th state right after the American Revolution, so that doesn't count quite yet. But it is a colony that will be established west of New Jersey on the Delaware River, and it's given as a land grant to this man here, and his name is William Penn. William Penn comes from a family that has been very friendly to the English monarchy. And the English monarchy right now is extremely unpopular in England itself. The king is a man by the name of James II. He is actually a Roman Catholic, and he is highly, highly, highly unpopular in his own country. William Penn belongs to another kind of outside religion called the Society of Friends, or the Quakers. These are radical Protestants who believe that God exists within the human being, within the soul of the human being. And that makes everyone have a rough degree of equality. Men and women, the enslaved and the free, children and parents, etc. Native people and Europeans all have this relative degree of equality in the eyes of Quakers. They don't believe in social hierarchy. They don't believe that anybody's better than anybody else, which in the 17th century, most people in Western Europe do believe that, you know, there's nobility and there are the rich and then there are the poor and they're different and one is inferior. That's not what Quakers in their ideal form believe. So James II, this Catholic king, hoping to keep some of his other religious outsider friends in England happy, gives a significant grant of land to this man here, William Penn, whose father was also a very good friend of the Stuart Kings. William Penn founds a new colony based on what he calls brotherly love, and Philadelphia is still known as the city of brotherly love. He believes in attempting to deal fairly with native people for access to their land. And his earnestness earns him the nickname Brother Onus, which means brother quill. It's a play on the word pen, from the local Lenape Indians, who appreciate his overtures of diplomacy to purchase land. He offers religious freedom in his new colony of Pennsylvania. By the way, I don't know if I told you, the year is roughly 1683. This is all kind of evolving. And that means that from the very beginning, Jewish settlers, Catholic settlers, all types of Protestants are free to live in the colony of Pennsylvania and worship as they please. And this gives us a little glimmer of modernity that we are comfortable with. I told you before that religion, then as now, could be a highly militarized thing, could be highly interwoven with the concept of the warrior and warfare. Well, also in the 17th century, you have the Quakers and their ideas. Now, if you were taking my colonial and revolutionary America class, we would be looking at the Quakers in a lot more detail. There's a lot of complexity there. I'm only giving you basics. But these are folks who are going to crop up again and again in American history and be very important when we start talking about the drive for emancipation and freedom. Pennsylvania as a colony attracts poor farmers looking for land, or not absolutely poor farmers, but because poor people could not afford to migrate generally unless they were bought as a servant to by someone else. It attracts farmers of middling ability, and really in Pennsylvania, they find that they could do better than they could in many parts of Europe, that there is more land available for them, and that the crops that they grow are more lucrative. So from the very beginning, Pennsylvania is going to be, aside from New York, one of the most diverse of the early American colonies. We're now going to start a discussion about the evolution of slavery. And before we start talking about this topic, I just want to make it very clear, as other historians do, that the enslavement of people and the racism that accompanies it in this particular sequence of events when Europeans and Africans came together did not have to unfold this way. Europeans and Africans had known of each other for millennia. Some of the key saints in early Christianity are people of color and African. There had been African emissaries from the great courts of African emperors from places like Songhai and Mali, who sent emissaries to Europe, and Europeans sent emissaries to these great leaders. So Africans appear in European art, working side by side with whites. So there is a sense here that what happened did not have to be a foregone conclusion. And on our drill down day on Friday, we'll discuss much more of this. But I'll give you the very basic ground strokes now, and they are this. American slavery began for two reasons: because there was a need for labor, and because there was a place where one could buy laborers and force them to work in an open-ended sort of way and in a coerced way. By the 15th century, the Portuguese navigators that we talked about the very first week we were together, had explored the west coast of Africa, and they had gained knowledge of the fact that there were many goods that you could buy in Africa that Europeans wanted. And one of those goods, I dislike reducing people to this, but I will for the purposes of this class, was that people were bought, sold, and traded throughout Africa. Two fellow Africans. First of all, we do tend to speak about Africa as almost being a country. It's not. It's extraordinarily diverse. It's so much larger than Europe, and people got along and people did not get along. So there are hostilities in Africa that played themselves out, and one of the end products of those hostilities is slavery. It is not, however, the slavery that we know that evolved on the western side of the Atlantic, in the sugar colonies of the Caribbean, and then in North America. It is quite different. And we'll talk about how it's different on Friday. But just so you know, and because there are a lot of people out there who are going to say, well, Africans were complicit in slavery, blah, blah, blah. Slavery existed in a very different way. And I'll talk about that on Friday. But for the purposes of this class, there's a need and there's a market. So there's an ability to bring those two things together, and the end product is the enslavement of millions of Africans. So where did enslaved people go when they were forcibly exported from Africa? The place where they were almost always sent first was the islands in the Caribbean that grew sugar. By a factor of 10, sugar is absolutely the most lucrative crop that is produced in the Atlantic world, and the most popular one. And the people who grow it are the richest. About 90% of the human beings who are enslaved are sent to the sugar colonies, where the sugar slavers are going to determine the people that they want to keep and buy and sell. And then the remaining people are going to be shipped up the coast of North America or to other ports on the mainland, where they will then be sold within maritime communities. At the very beginning of the American colonies, so those 13 colonies spanning from New Hampshire to Georgia, slavery was not present at the very beginning. And indeed, slavery is not terribly popular until about 1700. And one of the reasons for that is that slavery is based on work, or at least this slavery is. It's not meant to be a punishment for anything. It's not meant to be an arbitrary expression of racism. It is meant for work. And for a period of time, Europeans had a decent number of workers who were coming from their own cities and their own mother countries. Those workers were called indentured servants. And indentured servants were basically European servants who were obligated to work for a window of time for someone else. And in Virginia, that's where you find your first form of servitude. It really is among these indentured servants. But a couple things happen to change that. The first thing that happens is that the job situation gets better in England because of mercantilism. So there's more work now to do in England, manufacturing the New World raw goods into finished products. And then also the colonies just get a terrible, terrible reputation for being places where people die in droves because of new diseases, because of the strenuousness of work. So the workers really dry up. And that is when the purchasing of African slaves becomes more popular. Also, indentured servants only worked for a period of time. They were under contract to work, but they were still, European men and women who had a certain degree of rights. Africans are going to be stripped or never even given any rights of any kind when they cross the Atlantic or when they're forced to cross the Atlantic. And they can basically be worked under any circumstances which one could not do with white indentured servants. As I said before, slavery in the West Indies was a completely brutal affair. This shows a portion of the slave trade that imported people to places like Barbados, Jamaica, the island of Hispaniola, which is to the west is modern day Haiti, and which to the east is the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Bahamas, and then Barbados is right there, which even that tiny island was just kind of the seat of so much human misery. It kind of blows one's mind. This is where the sugar that fed Europeans, the sugar that people really wanted, was grown. And it was worth a lot of money. So slave traders would pack their ships as tightly as they possibly could. So you can see all of these figures here, all of these are human beings, and these human beings are shackled together below the deck of a vessel that was no doubt hot, that no doubt reeked of the byproducts of seasickness, and human digestive effluvia, and every bad thing you can think of. And then, of course, of death, as some people died, as disease might spread through the cargo, the human cargo, and people would pass away. Murder was not uncommon on these slave vessels, not because they employed murderers because they wanted an outlet for their feelings, but because their ultimate goal was to keep this enslaved cargo alive. So if anyone got ill during a voyage such as this, and an infectious disease was feared, the captain of the slave vessel would order 3 people on either side of the infected person to be taken up to the decks along with the infected person and thrown overboard, so that the rest of that human cargo would still be worth some money once they got to port. I'm speaking in a really kind of deadpan, non-emotional way, because there's simply no way to wrap your head around the terrors and the inhumanity of the transatlantic slave trade. We can see it kind of etched in the faces of these people who were being taken illegally after the slave trade had ended from English ports, and there was some smuggling of Africans, and a French sailor, an English sailor came aboard this vessel and etched the faces of those who were brought up to the deck to get fresh air and exercise. Again, not to be kind to them, just to make sure that they were in good physical shape so that they could be sold. And I think you can see the terror and the sadness and the despair of the people on this vessel. Slavery, I'll put it this way, I do not like for kidnapped, enslaved Africans to be called slaves. And I would prefer that you don't either. And it's for this reason. Because if we reduce the people who make up the story of American slavery to that one noun, then we are basically eradicating their entire story. We're erasing their humanity. We're making them into a noun instead of the individuals that they were. Being enslaved is a critical dimension of their existence. But here's what I really want to make clear about the status of slavery. Slavery exists and is protected by laws that allow one to own another human being, allow one to create rules that that human being must live by, and determine most parameters of that human being's life. Without support from the law, you would have a really difficult time with slavery existing. So what I am trying to say is that human slavery on the western side of the Atlantic evolves as a set of laws that are meant to keep human beings in a state of perpetual bondage unless by some chance they are given their freedom, which some were. So it is a legal distinction. It's not the person. The person is enslaved, but they are the person. Slavery is, and the distinction that you are a slave is a term within the law. And again, if you didn't have any laws, you wouldn't have slavery that could exist. These laws need to be invented, and they are invented throughout the course of the 17th century. I already kind of talked about the rise of slavery in the Chesapeake, the kind of dropping off of indentured servants, and also the ramping up of the kidnapping and selling of Africans in coastal cities of West Africa. And here you can see an advertisement for a cargo of human beings to be sold in a colonial city. That I believe it was, yes, it was Charleston in 1769, a cargo of 94 prime healthy. The term that they would have used is Negro. That is antiquated. We don't use that anymore. We use black with a capital B, consisting of 39 men, 15 boys, 24 women, and 16 girls, just arrived from Sierra Leone. And these are individuals who are being promoted for sale and will be sold in the South Carolina city of Charleston. What types of work did slaves do in a slave society, which is a society where you can find slavery everywhere? Slaves did everything, ranging from being master artisans, still enslaved, but people who created fine furniture, beautiful textiles, who were skilled musicians and entertainers, who were hairdressers and stylists, if I can use a modern term, ranging from being forced to work in very taxing and often brutal field conditions to bring in crops, to caring for children and individual family members. Basically, you can find enslaved people on every single level of colonial society doing a tremendously diverse amount of work. So we're going to move away from the topic of slavery for a few moments and address some topics that have to do with the maturing and the changing of American society or colonial society in those 13 original American colonies. And in our previous week, I talked a little bit about how in New England, and you would have read about this in your book, obviously, as well, New England has attracted a large number of extreme religious radicals called Puritans, how they've basically been able to pattern their society according to their own outlook and their own desires for the way they want to worship God and have their communities recognize that. And they were basically people off on their own. And if they were making money for the English Empire back at home, that was all well and good. They could kind of do what they wanted. But toward the end of the 1700s, really at the end of the 1780s, there are major changes going on in England that are really going to affect England's colonies. First of all, England manages to depose its hated Catholic king, James II, and his young Italian wife and their baby. They really don't want a Catholic dynasty to be ruling Protestant England, so they kick them out. And one of the reasons New Englanders are glad about this is that James II was trying to make all of New England and most of the middle colonies, as you can see here, into a mega colony called the Dominion of New England, which would just be under kind of one type of leadership and one set of expectations for its role within the empire. And the New Englanders were really, really, really upset about that because it took away their rights for self-governance, and it took away the role of the importance of religion within how they set up their colonial society. So there's a lot of anger over this and a lot of anxiety. Well, James II is deposed in 1688 in something called the Glorious Revolution, and this Dominion of England goes away. But it's just really hard for New England to get back the autonomy that it had. The new king, the new monarchs actually, William and Mary, James's Protestant daughter from an earlier marriage, and her Dutch husband, are pretty determined to rule in their own right. And they're not fond of colonies being able to make most, if not all, of their own decisions for themselves. So they are very reluctant to give New England these rights back that they originally had. And this basically puts New England into a bit of a tailspin. They wonder, well, what are we? What is the role of our faith anymore? Can we demand that our faith has certain privileges? At the same time, I don't know how well you can see it from this map. You can see the Nova Francia here, which is New France, or French, the French colonies up in this region. At the same time, England and France are at war, which means the English colonies and the French colonies are at war. So two things are putting tremendous pressure on New England. First of all, the New English don't push up into French Canada and attack the French and their Native American allies. And remember, the French are really good at making Native American allies, which the New Englanders are not. But the French and their Native American allies do attack New England, and they will attack New England for over 80 years. But this is really the start of it. So these European enemies and Native people are banding together to attack settlements on the fringes of New England. And they kill people, they take other people captive, they destroy farms, they destroy livestock. It's pretty terrifying to be living in these frontier regions, which are chiefly, sorry, I was kind of pointing in the wrong direction there, which are chiefly over in this area, which would be Maine, and then the skirts of New Hampshire, and then the center of Massachusetts. So all of that is going on. And then in the midst of that, you have this identity crisis where New England had its rights taken away and then some restored but not all of them. And that causes a lot of fear and distress. So it's kind of no surprise to historians that in 1692, there is a major fear that evil forces are at work to destroy New England, whether those evil forces come from French and Indians or whether they come from Satan himself. This is a part of the world, and these are people who really do believe that evil is a living agent in the world, and there is tremendous concern that that evil has broken out in New England and is threatening to take over New England and the lives of New Englanders, that the devil and all of his secret followers are everywhere and they're plotting to destroy New England and all that made New England special and godly. This is kind of the backdrop of the famous Salem witch trials, which are so complicated and so vast and so varied and so incredibly fascinating. But basically, it tells you the story of a very religious society, a very devout society, under a tremendous amount of stress and feeling like they found the explanation for it. Okay, that's it. It's the devil. This explains everything. Now we have to go out and find who's letting the devil in, and we've got to take care of these people and put them in jail, or if necessary, execute them and make sure this doesn't happen again. Folks, I've said it before, I will say it again. Salem is an aberration. It is not part and parcel of the New England way. New Englanders, for most of their existence in the 17th century, were not looking for their neighbors to be condemned as witches. Indeed, they needed their neighbors. They didn't want their neighbors to be witches. But something is very different here. What results is 6 months of hysteria in the county north of Boston, which is called Essex County, and that contains the town of Salem, but also a lot of other communities as well, where there are supposed outbreaks of, where there are outbreaks of supposed witchcraft accusations. And a lot of fear, a lot of concern, and a lot of unjust behavior. Just to point it, make some points of scale about this. 19 people are hung at Salem for witchcraft. 6 of them are men and 13 are women. A 7th man is executed in another way by having stones piled on top of his chest. It's something called pressing, and it was supposed to get a confession out of him, and when it didn't, it actually ended up killing him. So it's not all about looking for women or trying to control women. Men die at Salem too. But still, those deaths are tragic and highly unjust. One of the women executed was clearly mentally ill. I mean, she was deranged, and because she talked to herself and muttered things at neighbors she didn't like, she was murdered for it, or executed for it. In addition to that, there were almost 200 people in jail awaiting trial for witchcraft. And all of those people are going to be set free at the end of the summer. Who starts this crisis? Puritan leaders who believe some young girls are possessed, and then those young girls kind of move forward with accusations, and the whole thing kind of takes off. Who ends the crisis? Similarly, it's Puritans, many of whom never believed this was going on in the first place, and were trying to get their voices heard when they were saying things have gone too far, things are off course, this is evil in and of itself, this must stop. So those are some very, very basic ground strokes about the Salem witch trials. But I think what I want the takeaway to be is that, first of all, by the end of the 17th century, colonial worlds are really starting to collide. So the world of the English is colliding with the world of the French, and Native people in all regions are trying to figure out the best way to negotiate among these parties. So that is number one. Number two is that the colonial world itself is changing, and it's changing in some ways that colonists don't like. Some of them had crossed the Atlantic for highly ideological reasons, and those reasons are really starting to slough off and force them to change, and some of them don't like it. Salem is a very interesting capsule of those tensions, and sadly a tragic capsule of those tensions, and certainly something worthy of more study by people who are interested in it. There are lots of books on why this happened. The best of them out there are those that really tackle this world of profound tension. At the same time, there are newcomers who are coming to the English colonies, which are kind of widely open for migration. Other colonies are not. The Spaniards don't want non-Spaniards. The French don't want anyone who isn't Catholic. But the English colonies are a bit more generally open in their migration, and they start to attract many immigrants from specifically from Protestant German states. They are groups of people called pietists. And these pietists are pacifists, so they don't believe in war. And in addition to that, they are very worried about German princes who are allowed to come into their communities and just round up their sons and say, okay, you're going to fight in the army of the German prince. And they really, really want to keep that from happening. So they have their own religious visions, similar to like Puritans and Quakers, who are these religious outsiders who come to the New World to found their own colonies. So they're looking for a place to go on religious grounds, but they are also really looking to avoid fighting European fights that they feel that they really have no say in the matter of. So they come in highly significant numbers, specifically to Pennsylvania and to upstate New York. By the way, there are a few German Catholics thrown into this mix as well. Some of the earliest Catholics in the English colonies are from southern Germany, specifically from Bavaria. So it's not purely a Protestant thing. Some of these pietist groups are still with us. If anybody's ever heard of the Amish, they are descendant of these pietist groups. So are modern day Mennonites. Again, fall under this grab bag of the pietists. But the important thing about them is that they are a religious group who come to kind of determine their own futures. And in addition to that, that they are trying to escape kind of the militaristic hand of others. There's something very interesting about these German migrants, and that is that they come with the help of somebody called a Neuländer. And Neuländer, it means in German a new lander, is somebody who kind of comes to a new region, scopes it out, and says, yes, fellow immigrants, follow me. You'll have this, this, and this opportunity. This is what it's like here. This is what you have to do. This becomes a very common way of emigrating to the New World that persists all the way up until the 20th century. This is how the Irish migrate. This is how the Italians migrate. This is how the Greeks migrate. This is how the Jamaicans migrate. You send out the Chinese migrate. You send out an advance force, a person who kind of scopes out the lay of the land, figures out how things work, tells others what they need to do, and invites others to come over and to settle. So the role of the Neuländer is a really important one. We really see it for the first time with the immigration of Germans to Pennsylvania and to New York, to those colonies. Speaking of life in transition, so they add the story of a transition in who's attracted to the English colonies. We're going to increasingly see people who are not English, who are coming from places like Germany, who are coming from the Protestant parts of France, and then a group called the Scots-Irish, which we'll talk about next week. immigrant life isn't the only thing that is in transition. Native American life is very much in transition because of the settlement of Europeans and the continual movement of Europeans as they move west toward where Native people settle, or where Native people are trying to move to get away from them. But not everyone is trying to get away from these European settlers. Some Native American groups espouse the idea that developing very strong trade relationships with Europeans will be a positive good for their people and will transform lives in ways that they desire. And I think that you can see this in these two paintings here. They are two of the four Indian King paintings that were made by a Dutch artist by the name of Jan Verhelst, and he made them for the new Queen of England, who takes over after William and Mary, Mary's younger sister, Queen Anne. So these were painted in 1707, and these were painted as a gift to Queen Anne to show her fellow kings in the New World. They are both leaders of the Iroquois people of southern Canada and upstate New York. And the things that are very interesting about them, I mean, they're beautiful paintings and the color kind of doesn't do them justice. But the things that I wanted to add about them is that these are rich with European goods and European changes to Native American lifeways. First of all, you can really see it very clearly in this figure here. He is rich with red cloth, and red cloth was incredibly expensive in the early 18th century. It was made by gathering up little dried beetles called cochineals and then grinding them into a dye and then dyeing the fabric that way. You virtually never dyed things with botanical products that wouldn't last. You used either metals or other living materials. So the person who got this cape or this blanket was worth a lot of money, as are the ties on his moccasins as well. And then he's wearing this lovely, probably linen white tunic. And he also has something that doesn't even just look like a knife. It looks like a scimitar. And also he is wearing metal jewelry. So this is a man who is showing he's very clearly a Native American, but he's also arrayed in all of these European things that he kind of treasures. And you can tell that these European goods have really punched their way into his existence, and that they have now become part of his life and part of regular usage. And certainly the same can be said for this man here. This is black wool cloth, normally called generically homespun. He's wearing a European style haircut, again, the red cloak. And there are two elements I find really interesting about this painting. One of them is these heeled shoes with the silver buckle. He's not wearing the conventional moccasins that allow you to hunt. He's wearing these perfectly impractical for hunting shoes, maybe showing that he doesn't do any work. He doesn't need to hunt. He has people to do that for him. Instead, he wears these status items of the empire, these buckled shoes. And then also over here, a little hatchet of European manufacture. And very interestingly, that hatchet is buried in the ground. I'm sure some of you have heard the terminology of bury the hatchet. And burying the hatchet means that you put the hatchet's blade into the ground so that it couldn't be swiftly used to make a particularly painful or violent point about your feelings. So what is this? He's showing a symbol of peace. This man, perhaps not so much. He's showing a bit of a don't mess with me with a war club, but this king right here is showing the hatchet is buried. I am willing to play along with our queen, Queen Anne, or suggest that I play along. But the real story that I want us to get out of these images is the story of these goods and how goods that are of European manufacture are transitioning Native American lives for the people who live either within what Europeans have staked out as their colonies. Those borders, of course, are highly debatable. The further you go west, the less goods people have. And that is going to be a really key idea when we talk about westward movement as Anglo-Americans are going to surge into the West. But these things are clearly transforming. This man doesn't hunt anymore. This man uses a metal blade for his work instead of something that was made out of stone. These changes are coming to Native American lives and in some ways making things easier, in some ways, no doubt, building dependencies that are going to transform Native American folkways forever. Another thing that's being changed, and I'm realizing some of these images may not work so brilliantly in this YouTube format, so I'm enlarging them for you, is something called the consumer revolution. And when I talk about this in a class that drills down into this topic more, we spend a lot more time around it. But I'll just give you the broad strokes, and that is that when I was talking about mercantilism at the beginning of this presentation, using this slide up here, I talked about how finished goods came back to the colonies and they were sold in the colonies very cheaply so that people could consume them, so that people would find them accessible to purchase, and so that England could manufacture more and more and sell more and more, and that would make more money for the mother country overall. At the beginning of the 18th century, so we're moving from the end of the 1600s into the beginning of the 1700s, you have something called the Consumer Revolution, where lots of finished goods are flowing into communities in England's 13 colonies. And people are able to buy these goods. These goods, and this is really important, mes amis, I want to write these down. Goods, finished goods in the colonies are a fraction of the cost of what they would be for people living back in England. And you might say, well, that's weird. These goods are being manufactured in England. It's not so weird. This is actually by design. This is to make sure that the colonies continue to play this mercantilist game by sending all of their raw goods, or as many as England desires and wants, over to England so that they can get these cheap finished goods back and feel really good about their quality of life. As a result, for many white colonists, their standard of living, their way of living is considerably higher than their peer in England might be able to enjoy. Their peer in England would not have access to the same goods at cheap prices that they do. In addition to this, ship technology has evolved in such a way to make sure that lots and lots of goods are surging across the Atlantic fairly quickly and making it very safely to American markets. This idea is going to be key and very, very important as we approach the American Revolution. And it's going to be key for this reason. The American colonists are able to live in ways that the English back in England can only envy. But the English back in England are full English subject citizens. American colonists might look like they're doing very well as English men and women, but they're living in the colonies and they are treated differently because they're living in the colonies. They are treated as inferiors. So you might have all of these wonderful goods. You might have the equivalent of a McMansion in the colonial world. You do not have the same rights as a farmer who doesn't have nearly as much stuff as you have back in England, because he is living in England and he is a full citizen subject. You're a colonist. You're a different type of human being. And that ideology is really going to clash during the American Revolution. One more topic I want to talk about before this lecture is over, and that is the state of women in the household. I think when I was a kid growing up during the American bicentennial, I thought that all colonial people were dainty and pretty and clean and European. I didn't even really know that slavery existed, and that they danced the minuet together. I thought, colonial life must have been very good. Well, colonial life was, in the words of the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, often nasty, brutish, and short. And I would add to that, dangerous. If you were an enslaved woman living in the American colonies, you were often a victim of sexual assault, if not out and out rape. You could be sold away from the people that you loved. You could be physically tormented. And then on top of this, you would have all of the very, very heavy physical labor that early American women had to do. Early American women, for the most part, were physically really well built up because they were doing things like hauling water, churning butter, making soap out of dangerous chemicals in huge vats and barrels, slitting the necks of chickens, feeding livestock, slitting the necks of hogs, and butchering these animals, working around fire constantly, brewing. They did, and they're doing all of this in structures that barely qualify as houses. They are not housewives. They don't have enough stuff to make them housewives. The housewife is really an invention of the 19th century and an industrialization. They are not cleaning for the most part. They are not taking care of children. Children take care of themselves or each other. Cleaning? What did you have to clean? They are doing a whole lot of cooking, but a lot of that cooking is preparatory to being able to preserve food and store away food for a future time. In addition to that, they are helpmates for their spouses. There is no real separation of spheres between women's work and men's work for the vast majority of colonists, Black and white. Women work in fields. Slave women are enforced to do so, often with minimal clothing, which is not granted to them. Women of European origin are sometimes hooked up to plows when horses or oxen are not available to be used. No doubt women of color were as well. Both are contributing to the household. Women only stay closer to the house to tend to babies and really to breastfeed them. And once they are weaned, they go out into the wider world of work. When men are away, women run shops, women handle money, women deal with professional letters or commercial letters, women manage households, women manage the work of other men. So we really need to banish from our ideas this idea that early American women were housewives. They were not. They were physically hardworking, aggressive, producers who were equal contributors to household economies. I'm going to end things there. Any questions that you have, please bring to Friday's drill down exercise. And I look forward to seeing you in person on Friday. We will be focusing on the rise of chattel slavery and the slave trade and slave societies, but I will entertain questions about any content from the online lecture.